Well, it is a pleasure to be among those that love the cause of liberty. As you might well imagine, sometimes we don't have as many friends in the audience as I expect we have today. So thank you for being here. I love to associate with fellow lovers of liberty. You can see the title on the screen is To Preserve the Nation. It seems like a target fixation for me. Everything I do, I've got a book out called To Preserve the Nation, a lecture series out to preserve the nation. I do a talk radio show called To Preserve the Nation. You'd think I've got something on my mind, and this is what it is. We are in grave danger today of losing the great foundation that this nation was established upon. And as Bill pointed out or mentioned in my introduction, his introduction, I guess I should say, this is there's an absolute unremitting attack on the Constitution by attempting to call a new convention. Now, that's kind of where we're going to go with this today, but we got to kind of back into that a little bit. So to understand how sometimes seemingly innocuous and maybe even good ideas can lead to problems. And so I'm going to approach it a little bit differently. But as we begin here, I want to kind of set the stage from the beginning, if you will. During the Revolutionary War, George Washington wrote the following. He says, "You will therefore send me none but natives and men of some property if you have them." Okay? Well, what he really wanted was a group of guards and soldiers that he could trust. People that had skin in the game, if you will. And oftentimes this order that he put out is simplified to say, put none but Americans on guard tonight. Well, we face dire challenges today, much like was faced in the revolutionary times. We have many detractors. And in light of these modern risks, I would slightly modify George Washington's statement and say, put none but Americans who understand and apply sound Americanist principles on guard tonight. You know, it's interesting, when I wrote my book and my editors were going through and I used the term Americanist a lot, they said, that's not a word. I said, yeah, it is. No, it's not, they said. You got to pick another word. I said, no, that's a good word. I says, we have communist, we have socialist, we have welfare statist, we need Americanists. And so I prevailed, and it's throughout the book. But the fact of the matter is, these Americanist principles are unique among all the principles of government in the whole world. They are sound, they are good, they are noble. And in fact, when they started to be applied, an amazing thing happened. This little backwater, dusty colony set of states that couldn't figure out which direction they were going pulled together and stood up, dusted themselves off, and walked forward into what is now our history as the greatest, freest, strongest, most happy, and most powerful nation on earth. And the nations of the world were absolutely astounded. What happened? And they came to find out and try and figure out what made this country so amazing. And it's these Americanist principles. And that's what's under attack today. Well, that's what I want to, and I'll end with this again too. We need those that understand and apply these Americanist principles if we're going to retain this great blessing of liberty that was won at such great cost by those that established this nation. One thing I've noticed over the last few years is that there's many newly awakened Americans. There's some that are paying attention again. Whew, it feels so good to see that there's some that have started to wake up. But they perceive something's wrong. But many of them don't have the foundation of background necessary to actually stand with the principles, and they can be distracted and diverted. They know something's not right in America, and among them, now I don't want to get anybody, there may be Tea Party members here today, and I'm not criticizing that at all, thank you. I consider some of my best friends to be Tea Party members. Now, how many people say that kind of stuff? I think Roosevelt said it about communists, didn't he? But at any rate, no, don't take it that way. The fact of the matter is that there are so many Tea Party members that, unlike many in this audience, have really never really immersed themselves in these principles. And you know, T stands for taxed enough already. I agree with that completely. But I'm not singling the Tea Party members out. I'm using it as an example of what may happen when those that wish to fulfill their own agenda can somehow capture and co-opt those that are enthusiastic about something, and they might even be enthusiastic about something that's good. Like, I hope everybody in this audience really believes that we are taxed enough. And so I don't think we'll have an argument about that. But the danger is if those that understand that or feel that in their heart get co-opted. So please don't think this is a criticism of Tea Party. It's just an example. I'm going to take one example and kind of play it through to the end, if you will, and then show you dozens of other causes that could be co-opted also. And we'll briefly touch on those because we don't have time. And believe me, it would be interesting and exciting to cover every one of those and expose the concerns that should go along with each one of these other causes. But nonetheless, with that said, let's go forward and just look at this one issue and how it could be co-opted. Okay, so to these Tea Party activists, and of course many others, they believe that our financial woes in this country, oh, ain't it awful, these budget issues, these huge multi-trillion-dollar debts, et cetera, they're the sum and substance of all of America's problems. I got news for you folks, we got lots of other problems too. It's not just financial. It's a big problem, yes, but it is not the only problem. And again, we're not going to try and expand to all of those other problems, but the fact of the matter is, if you think it's the only problem, sometimes you get tunnel vision or target fixated. We used to call it in the military. And see me after if you want to understand what target fixation can do to you. Because you lose your perspective and you actually sometimes don't live. Anyway. Well, with the perspective they've got that financial woes are the sum and substance of our problem, well, to some of those people, they believe a balanced budget amendment, or BBA, is the solution. You fix the budget, America's fixed. Well, it's a fatal concept. It really, truly is, if it's carried forward to the nth degree. I want to fix the budget, but there's a better way to do it than what's being proposed. Well, let's just kind of tell you what's going to happen. It will lead to a Constitution Convention, or a con-con, as we call it here. So if you catch me using the term con-con, it's kind of a shorthand for a Constitution Convention. And in a minute, hopefully you'll be able to say, wow, I see the path they're leading us on. Well, let's look at the facts. It's said that those that are unwilling to remember the past are condemned to repeat it. You know, you look at The Tempest, Shakespeare, the play, what's past is prologue. It's just an introductory to the future. So we got to go back sometimes to go forward. So that's, we'll look at this. Back in 1983, some of you have probably been in this fight at least that long. And I hope some of you are able to stand decades longer if you've been in it that long, because we need all the friends we can get in this battle. But back in 1983, an effort was made to call a Constitution Convention for a balanced budget amendment. Some of you may have been involved in that and seen what we went through to fight that. Remember in Article 5 of the Constitution, it says that, and this is a direct quote, on the application of the legislature of 2/3 of the several states, Congress shall call a convention. It says shall. It doesn't say woulda, coulda, shoulda, oughta. It says shall. It's an imperative. You will call a convention when you get 2/3 of the states that have asked for one. Okay? Well, 2/3 is equal to 34 in our current configuration of 50 states. And 32 states back in 1983 called for a convention. Woohoo. Can you say Nat's eyelash? We are very close to having a convention. And the powers that were seeking this were they were highly organized, and they were cleverly disguised, and they were powerfully promoted, much like the effort today. Only today is more highly organized, it is more cleverly disguised, and it is much more powerfully promoted. Millions and millions are being spent on this. Well, what was their logic? Well, they were going to threaten to call a convention, and by so doing, Congress was going to be frightened into passing a balanced budget amendment through that traditional Article 5 amendment process. So it's kind of like you run it right up to the edge of the cliff and, oh, Congress will respond. Okay, that was the argument that was promoted. Well, again, remember, out of Article 5, it says if 2/3 to amend the Constitution in the traditional way that every one of our amendments have been achieved under to date. We've never had another convention since 1787 for the national government. But in all the 27 amendments we currently have, this is how it was done. 2/3 of both houses of Congress propose and then approve and then it becomes a proposed amendment. It is not an amendment until 3/4 of the states ratify. See, people always say to me, "Oh, Bradley, you are such a worrywart." You know, honestly, even if we get a convention, it's still going to have to be ratified by 3/4 of the states. So quit worrying. 3/4 of the states are not going to fall for that. How did we get in the mess we're in now? We got the vast majority of people, it seems today, are following a path that takes us away from proper principle. But the fact of the matter is, let's look back at history again for just a moment. When the convention came together in May of 1787, the existing Constitution was the Articles of Confederation. The Articles of Confederation, they were called together. In fact, the charter of those that were called together to this convention, the charter said they were charged with the responsibility to revise the then existing Constitution, the Articles of Confederation. You look up revise in Noah Webster's 1828 dictionary. He was a founding father, by the way. He was in Philadelphia, although he wasn't at the convention. Noah Webster's dictionary, you look up revise and you find it says amend. So their charge was to amend the existing Constitution. A convention is an autonomous body. They can do what they darn well please, in other words. Now, obviously, it just doesn't automatically happen. There's processes that must be gone through, and one of those processes is ratification if they change anything. But the existing Constitution at the time, the Articles of Confederation, required 100% of the states to agree to any changes. 100, everybody. Well, the founders knew they weren't going to get that because Rhode Island wasn't even attending. So they knew automatically that wasn't going to happen, and so they lowered the bar. Now, they were good and wise and honest men. They were honorable men. They were men that understood liberty, that had been tried in the crucible, and they were refiner's fire and all that. They wanted liberty. But they wanted to make sure that they carried forth with this new Constitution, and so they lowered the bar to 9 states instead of 13. Now, they did that ratification modification without prior approval of Congress, without prior approval of the states, without prior approval of the people. In no way, shape, or form were they granted any authority to assume that 9 states would be okay. But they wrote it into the new convention, Constitution. And it was submitted for ratification, and 9 did ratify it, and it became the Constitution. So what can we learn from that? We can learn that a convention is autonomous. They set aside the existing Constitution, they wrote a new Constitution, they brought a new one forth, and they changed the ratification process in that whole situation. So therein lies the danger, a major danger in the Constitution Convention. And it's the precedent that we have. So, was it worth that risk? Would it be today? I think not. I think it's a pretty high stakes game of chicken is what it really, who's going to blink or run off the road, or however any of you played chicken when you were kids. Well, let's go back and look too. How did we get into this multi-trillion-dollar mess that we're in now? And it is a mess. It's a huge mess. Well, let's go back. Let's go back before the 17th Amendment that happened. Before that time, senators were directly elected by the people. Excuse me. The 17th Amendment elects the people, elects the senators directly by the people. But before that, there was a different program. Before the 17th Amendment, the U.S. House represented the people. It did before, and it does still. U.S. House is directly elected by the people. But the senators were appointed by the state legislatures. Now, it's very interesting to me, this thing of government is all about power. It's all about power. And the founders had lived under tyranny, and they were so careful that they did not want to re-enter that they were careful in enumerating the powers granted to the national government. They granted them specific and limited power that is carefully enumerated in the body of the United States Constitution. And by so doing, they wanted to contain the government to operate within that jurisdiction, if they will, that they granted it. But it was more than just giving the national government a certain set of power. They divided and subdivided power within the national government. The Senate and the House are the legislative body, but yet the power was divided between them in a way that would hopefully prevent a tyranny from being implemented. And of course, the executive handled a different set of power, and the judiciary did also. But it was more than that. They were so careful about power, they wanted to make certain that they also divided and subdivided the sources of power. And if you'll read carefully the words of the Founding Fathers, St. George Tucker's view of the Constitution of the United States is recommended reading this matter in regards to how they divided and subdivided where the power came from that put the people in office. The House represented the people and got their power from the people. And by the way, they also they had an inverse proportional in terms of the most power was granted the least amount of time in the office. Who's the least amount of time in the office? The House. Why? Because their power source is the people, which is a pretty big, if you get people moving, you've got a real power behind you, and they also had the power of the purse. So the House had the power of the people behind them. The Senate was to represent the issues of the states. It gave the states a seat at the table at the national government. Okay? And the president, they had over 60 ballots to decide how they were going to get him. And without going into detail there, it was a very interesting balancing act where they ultimately came up with a single-purpose legislative body that did their job, dissolved, and he couldn't play to that constituency anymore. And of course, who has life sentence? I mean, excuse me, who's in for? No. I say they should have life oftentimes, but the fact is the judiciary does not have a life sentence. They're only good for good behavior, which could bring up another discussion, I'm certain. But the fact of the matter is, all had different sources of power. The way you became a Supreme Court justice was different than the way you became a member of the House. Okay, so having said that, there was this delicate balancing and separating and dividing power, even down to the sources of power. And before the 17th Amendment, that delicate balance was largely intact. Well, again, we're still before the 17th Amendment, and even today, the House always has and continues to buy votes back home. They go out and they say to special interest groups, what do you want? Oh, vote for me, I'm your man. What do you want? Same with you, and you, and you, and you. When they got back to the House, after they'd been making all these promises, it was a pretty good job. They wanted to keep it. And they were concerned that if they didn't fulfill their promises, they wouldn't be able to keep it. And they looked around, they found that they were surrounded, and their colleagues in the House had all made promises. And it was like, hey, I'll help you get yours if you'll help me get mine. How does that work? So that's what they did. The House has always done that. They made promises. And they saw it once they got there. They didn't have to take the money out of their own pockets to fulfill those promises. They took it out of your well, actually the public treasury, I guess I should say, but the fact of the matter is they fulfilled those promises out of the public treasury. It's a quid pro quo kind of thing. You help scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. Who benefits? Cui bono, all that kind of stuff. At any rate, that's how the House always has operated. But before the 17th Amendment, the states appointed their senators out of the state legislature. Interesting. Different dynamic there. So the senators, therefore, were charged with the responsibility of reviewing issues from the state's perspective. Yes, they were United States senators, but always in the back of their mind, just like the members of the House are thinking, hey, the guys back home are watching me. If I don't deliver my promises, they're going to kick me out of office. The senators looked behind them and they saw who put me in office. It was my state legislature. I've got to keep their interests in mind while I'm here. Okay, kind of an interesting thought process. What's interesting that was a dynamic that in there that before the 16th and 17th Amendments, the states in essence were billed for federal budget shortfalls. How did that work? Well, you look at the United States Constitution, Article 1, Section 2, Clause 3, and you'll find that it states direct taxes shall be apportioned among the several states. Apportioned, that's divided up among the several states. And Article 1, Section 9, Clause 4 says, no capitation or other direct tax shall be laid unless in proportion to the census or enumeration herein before directed to be taken. So they did it by population. So let's just say there was a state that had 1 million people in it and a state that had 100,000 people in it. The state that was 1 million got a bill 10 times bigger because there was 10 times more people. They didn't do it based upon trying to ascertain which state was the richest, which one had the most horses or whatever. No, it was based upon population. Interesting. So the states with a higher population got a bigger bill. Well, everybody then, in essence, throughout the nation got the same per capita bill. Okay. Well, So if the budget shortfalls came in at the national level that needed more tax revenues, the states basically were told, collect it and send it in based upon your population. How do you think that made the legislatures feel? They like their job too. And they don't want to be known as the tax-raising rascals that were sent back to office. So that made them look bad if they had to raise the taxes on their constituency. And so what do you think they'd say to the senators? Don't send me a bill. I don't want to have to face that. I want to keep my job too. Okay, so because of that, the senators protected the states from these budget shortfalls, and they removed, when the House, remember the House, Article 1, Section 7 says that the House basically originates these revenue bills, okay? House puts in all this pork, swells the budgets up huge, send it over to the Senate goes, whoa, we don't have that much money coming in. So they took out all the pork, passed it, sent it back over to the House and said, don't put it back in. We'll keep taking it out and we'll have gridlock. That's what we call it now. The House members could go back to their constituency and they could say, hey guys, we put it in, but those rascals in the Senate took it out. I kept my promise, they just didn't. Send me back again. And they kept working. It was a great system. But that system worked so well because it gave the states a kind of a check, checks and balances, pushback. Madison wrote about this. Everybody has to have pushback to keep them all in their place. Well, and this interesting thing that's become vogue today of states' rights was not a big issue because the states were recognized as having a place at the table, if you will. So these problems of big spending and states' rights weren't big problems before the 16th and 17th Amendments. Now, after the 16th and 17th Amendments, 16th Amendment, by the way, is the justification for the direct tax on the people. So now they don't send the bill to the states, they send it directly to you. Well, they don't send it directly to you, you just send your money in, okay? But the fact of the matter is, it took the states out of the equation that way too. After the 16th and 17th Amendment, the people still are represented in the House. And the people are now represented in the Senate. Oh, that changed that power dynamic that we talked about earlier. The states lost their seat at the table at the national level. And now both the House and the Senate, by votes, by making their promises. So now the House and Senate both by votes back home. Vote for me. What do you want? I'll give it to you. Okay, great. And then they both come back and they look at each other and they say, we got to fulfill these promises. Help us get this together. Guys, I need to get this passed. You need to get that passed. I'll help you. You help me. So each of them inserts pork into the budget. Now it comes out of the House pork laden and then it goes over to the Senate and gets more pork added to it. It's kind of an interesting dynamic. The bills get huge when you do this. They're just huge. But the fact of the matter is that everybody that's there wants their pork to pass. And because of that, votes on budget bills almost always are 60% or over in favor. These are called supermajorities. Remember that because we're going to come back to supermajorities here in a little while. Okay? But they're huge favorable ratings because everybody wants their pork in there. Okay. The states also became irrelevant in the system because the legislatures didn't have any more leverage on the senators. Okay, and so now we're getting huge debts because of this. We can prove this. Let's track this. We know the debts in a year. We know the population in a given year. You can do the math. Any fifth grader could do that. Well, I used to be able to. But the fact of the matter is that if you can do the math, you can do the division that says, here's the debt, here's the population, here's the per capita, per person debt. Okay? So let's look at 1800. Brand new nation. We had debt. The nation was not out of debt. There had been debts incurred to win the Revolutionary War. War always causes debt. It's a fact of life. So do the math. $15.63 per person. Most of you here today could take that out of pocket change. Okay? Even for every member of your family. 100 years later, it hadn't even doubled. $28.12. But that's because the system was there and it was working. By the way, the country had more people, but it also had more debt because we'd had this little thing called the Civil War. Nothing civil about it, but it was a civil war and it caused a lot of debt. There had been some other things like the Mexican War and the Spanish-American War and so on, but they always add debt. At any rate, 100 years, less than double. Okay? Then we have what I call the perfectly horrible storm. 1913 comes along. We get Amendment 16, we get Amendment 17, you know, the income tax, and we get where the senators lose their appointment by the states, and we also get the Federal Reserve put into place. Man, perfect storm against liberty happened that year. Well, let's roll forward until 1990. I've got shorter intervals than I'm looking at here because you're going to see some absolutely, it metastasizes amazingly. By 1980, $4,106 per person is what it had grown to. By 2006, $30,200 per person. It's over 1,000 times what it was about 100 years prior to that time. And you look at today, it's almost 2,000. It's just short of 1,900 times what it was just 113 years ago. Whoa. That precious balance, that dynamic that I think was really put there under the inspiration of God, because the founders actually thought that. What have we done to ourselves? By improving the Constitution with these amendments, we've actually destroyed a great foundation there. At any rate, our current national admitted debt is over 16 trillion. It's almost 17. Not quite, and it's growing. Actually, our real debt is about 7 to 9 times that amount. It's over $123 trillion because of unfunded liabilities. These are things we have committed to pay in the future, but we are not collecting money for now. We have a contract to pay, but there's no way we're putting money away. It's IOUs at best. Okay, so the real debt is over $1 million per taxpayer. That's not per person, that's per taxpayer. Okay? Interesting tragedy that we're facing here. Can you see why the Tea Party people are upset about this? I'm upset about it. I hope you are. Anyway, what I've just told you should be ample warning to say there's a danger here in messing with the Constitution, that delicate, wonderful balance that was created back in 1787. Well, it's proved disastrous. It literally has. And it's my contention that anything that's more or less than the Constitution pertaining to the laws of man really is going to bring about evil. That's where I'm coming from on this thing. That's why I'm so adamant that we'll restore it back to the initial process that was originally established. Now, we all want to balance the budget. Well, I think everybody in this room does. Obviously, in a minute, you're going to understand that everybody doesn't want to balance the budget, because if they did, it would. Okay? But let's just say that we have this great movement moving forward that we want to balance the budget, but does Congress really want to balance the budget? Well, to do it would take a mere majority. That's all 218 congressmen and 51 senators. That's a mere majority in both houses. They could do it. There doesn't even have to be one state involved in it. Okay? But a balanced budget amendment takes 2/3 of both houses and then requires the ratification of 3/4 of the states. So, 290 congressmen, 67 senators, and 38 states are required to do a balanced budget amendment. Interesting. Help me with this math, because some reason it eludes me. We could balance the budget today without a balanced budget amendment with 218 congressmen, but it would take 290 congressmen to get a balanced budget amendment. It would take 51 senators today to balance it, but it will take 67 to do an amendment. It doesn't take any states to do it. And what did I say? 38 states to ratify a balanced budget? So if you can come up with the numbers on your right, how hard would it be to come up with the numbers on your left? Something doesn't add up here, does it? Do they really want to balance the budget, or what? Well, okay. If 2/3 of both houses approve a balanced budget amendment, what about the states? What about the states? Is it a done deal? We're going to see. Will they just ratify or not? Well, 38 states are required to ratify, but will they? Let's just take the home state that I live in, Utah. Right now in Utah, the feds are dealing us crack cocaine. They don't call it that, they call it federal dollars. Okay? It's just as addictive and just as destructive. Okay? And half of Utah's annual budget comes from federal dollars. You know, every time I tell people about something, whether it's an EPA issue or something like that in my home state, and I'm talking to a legislator or something. Oh, if we do that, they say we'll lose our federal subsidy. They call it different things, but that's what it is. I say, what? You know, we had a saying when I was a kid, and I don't remember the origins even of it, honestly, but you'll get the vision of it. We used to say, you accept their nickel, you accept their noose. You let them put the leash around your neck, and you let them lead you wherever you want to go. And again, I don't remember the origins, but we used to say it a lot. You sold yourself, folks. Utah's selling itself for the billions of dollars that are being sent from the feds every year. I don't know. To date, I have not found many, if any, legislators that are saying, we'll cut the cord if we have to, because we want to be, again, a standalone, freestanding, sovereign state. I can't find many that will say that, if any. But Utah, okay, but let's say I talked to enough. Would Utah risk that? I don't know. But then we've got all the other states. I mean, I put a few up here. There's people from some of these states here I know. New York, Illinois, California, Massachusetts, pick them. Pick your state. Do your math. Look at where you're getting your money in your state. I suspect you're going to find that a large portion of the money in your state is coming from the federal government. Like I say, crack cocaine couldn't be any more addictive or destructive. Here's an estimate. I put a couple of states together just to give you some idea of the spread on the take. Utah, my home state, we get over $6,200. This was 2009. $6,200 per person in our state from the feds. Virginia is on the take a little bit more, $15,200 plus. Okay? The states are in there somewhere. Find your state, do your research, whatever, but you'll find that it's addictive and it's really progressive. Okay. Here's another thing to think about. The people who are elected to the House and Senate are the ones that got us into this mess. They're the people we sent back there, and they did it. They have complete control to do the right thing. They literally could, but they didn't. And the people want who they elected, right? And the states want the federal funds. That's a thought-provoking thought. Well, so what are the real chances that our elected representatives and the states will opt to balance the budget? Well, or even adopt a balanced budget amendment. I think the chances of either are slim and none. Well, but just for the sake of argument, let's say that 2/3 of both houses pass the balanced budget amendment and 3/4 of the states ratify the balanced budget amendment. Let's just say that that happened. Will the budget be balanced? I have here in my hand 8 proposed balanced budget amendments that are currently before the House and the Senate. There's 7 of them in the House, 1 in the Senate. And I've annotated and commented on all of them. It's got all the people that are supporting them too. I always ask people, when I ask that question, will the budget be balanced if we get an amendment? And then they say, well, obviously it will be. I say, have you read the amendments? The proposed amendments? Well, I've had to kind of generalize because, as I say, I have 8 of them here. I've had to generalize a little bit in this little review we're going to do. But in general, this tracks with what we're finding in those amendments. Okay, here's what they're proposing. They allow for continued deficit spending with supermajority votes. Huh? Do we have that already? I think we do most of the time because these guys buy their votes back home. That's what we talked about earlier. That's why you get these big majorities on these budgets, because everybody said, I want my pork in there, you want yours in? Okay, I'll support yours if you'll support mine. Most of these have, and it's either 60% or 3/5. Excuse me, 3/5 or 2/3. So those are the 2 things, but most of them are 60%. Okay, you remember why that always happens. Okay, and if they can't get a supermajority to continue their deficit spending, taxes must be raised. And there's different trigger points that would say taxes get raised. Now, I don't care how much you like paying taxes. Sooner or later, I suspect we'll reach a threshold where in your life you're saying enough is enough. Okay? So if they can't get the deficit raised by these supermajorities, somebody's going to say we still got to pay for these things. And so they have mechanisms by which they can raise the taxes to do that. Okay? And if a war happens, of course we haven't had a declared war since the 1940s, but they address that too, so don't worry. But if a war happens, and war always causes debt, you can continue deficit spending if there's a majority vote, okay? But also if there's a national security threat, you can continue to deficit spend. Okay, now folks, I got news for you. They say that the national security threat, you know, this nude photo op that I had to fly out here, and these egregious violations of the Fourth Amendment, and you know, all these things that they do at the airport, that's part of the thing about this generational thing, okay? That's been going forward for almost a dozen years now. Okay, so, and they also have they fabricated the fact that they don't have to address it real quickly, because most of them delay it until 5 years after they've had their ratification. Oh. So they kick the can down the road again and again and again. So what about this off-budget stuff of fudging the budget, if you will, by doing it off-budget? I wonder if that's going to continue too. I just wonder. I don't know. So here up to this point, Congress could balance the budget if they wanted to with just a mere majority. And they deficit spend because they want to get reelected. And we back here at home want to devour their pork. So we elect representatives to keep throwing it to us. And a balanced budget wouldn't pass both houses, 2/3. And if it passed, 3/4 of the states wouldn't ratify it because of the reasons we've stated. And if passed and ratified, it still wouldn't balance the budget. What was the real agenda? It's a ploy, folks. It really, truly is a ploy. It's theatrics. It really is political rhetoric. It's an example of them unwilling to get serious about anything to seek a solution to the deficit problem. Right now, the deficit is growing at about $1.2 trillion per year. Well, recently, back last summer, when they raised the deficit ceiling, they created an unconstitutional supercommittee between the House and the Senate with appropriate and delegated people to go sit there and decide how they're going to cut spending by $1.2 trillion over the next 10 years. 10 years. Okay, the committee failed. They couldn't agree on anything. It just, it was just too hard a task to cut $1.2 trillion out of the next 10 years' budgets. Okay, let's do the math. I know that we're approaching 16 trillion, but we're not, I mean 17 trillion, but we're not quite there yet. So let's say the current deficit's 16 trillion. Let's do the math. They were going to cut the actual growth is 1.2 trillion every year. And so that 10-year growth would add another $12 trillion to the debt. That would bring us to total after 10 years of $28 trillion. If that committee had been successful in cutting $1.2 trillion over 10 years, that would have left us with a, what? $26.8 trillion debt? If they had been successful, and they weren't. Huh? What? Who are they kidding? Well, but when we don't get this balanced budget, there's going to be this cry that goes out. Oh, woe is me. There's something we got to do. Oh, they're going to, good and caring Americans are going to be motivated because they can't get Congress, number one, to balance the budget. Number two, they can't get them to bring, through the normal process of 2/3 of both houses, to send something out to be ratified the states, and so they're going to call for a Constitution Convention. And that's where we are in America today. Okay? Remember how close we got back in 1983? 32 had called for it. It's even more highly organized, cleverly disguised, and powerfully promoted today. They have been trying for decades to destroy the sound foundation of the nation by getting rid of the Constitution. And they'll do it a little bit at a time or a whole bunch at a time. It just depends on what we'll let them get away with. Well, this balanced budget amendment thing is a conservative rallying point. And there's lots of others. But let me just tell you just briefly, there's an organized effort. This is a senator from my home state, and he is a co-founder of a balanced budget amendment task force. The purpose of this organization is to call a convention when we don't get a balanced budget amendment. That's all they're going to do. There's been lots of others that have carried things, and there's just no end of ways that they're trying to wheedle this into us. The American Legislative Exchange Council has promoted with the Goldwater Institute, and there's their websites if you want to look them up, a very organized effort. I've got a 40-page document that I've reviewed carefully, and I think that They act like they've done everything in their power to prevent a runaway convention, but there's too many words like could, might, should, probably, promise, depending, likely, reasonable, just about, and nearly in there for me to be really comfortable with it. I mean, it's not bulletproof. And boy, I'll tell you, there's just too much at stake. They call it different things, an amendments convention or an Article 5 convention, to avoid calling it a con-con. But it arose by any other name, it still arose. Okay, and they promote the idea that they could limit it. And I think, based on what I've read, there's some people that have promoted this that are really trying to do that. But there's too many of those wiggle room words that I told you about, that you just can't be sure. And in fact, this Robert Nadelson guy, that's one of their chief proponents, says in some of his written material that, as you read down here, going so far as to specify in the resolution applying for an amendments convention that there must be an up or down vote on specific amendment text is vulnerable to legal challenge. So even one of their chief adherents to this is telling us in his written material that even if you tried to snaffle them down to as tight as you possibly could, it might not work. Okay? So here's a bunch of other things. They want to clarify how they do an Article 5 convention. They want federal debt requiring approval of the majority of state legislatures. They want the ability to repeal any federal law with 2/3. I mean, these are honestly tax issues. There's so many amendment issues out there right now that if one doesn't get us, another will if we don't fight all of them. I mean, these tax issues. Here's one, that funded mandates imposed on the states by the national government are allowed. So if they pay for it, put the noose around your neck again. Okay, let's just say we got a funded mandate. This says all states will collect firearms from their citizens. We'll pay for it. Well, that would be allowed under this. Okay? Can you see if they're violating the Constitution, even if they pay for it, it's wrong? Okay? The Bricker Amendment. Some of you that have been around the society a long time understand the Bricker Amendment, which get rid of the impression that treaties can modify the Constitution. It's a false impression. We can prove it every way to Sunday, but it's one that Dwight Eisenhower and his Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, promoted back in the 50s, and it's been taught and told so many times that this lie, well, anyway. The McCain-Feingold violates First Amendment already, and now we want to maybe change that McCain-Feingold. Just term limits. Articles of Confederation had term limits in them. Article 5 did. Founders knew about term limits. They didn't put them in. Who would want to term limit James Madison out of the House? Huh? If they're doing their job and keeping it within bounds, it's fine. We already have term limits to the ballot box anyway. Line item veto. Oh my goodness. Give the president super legislative power. Just so many things. Let's just go to something here that's just got to get your attention. An amendment clarifying the meaning of the Second Amendment. Clarifying? Huh? And then there's another effort out there to remove the Second Amendment entirely. Anyway, there's also an effort out there to completely rewrite the Constitution. I have copies of constitutions that have been written and could easily be slipped under the door. They claim that this method that the Goldwater Institute is promoting, that couldn't happen. But if you've read Wolverton's excellent article in the 21st of January New American, you'll understand he's covered a lot of that material in there about how it could become a runaway convention. Well, others say, well, if the founders put this in the Constitution, they wanted us to use it. Well, here's a letter from James Madison, written November of 1788. The Constitution had been ratified in the summer previous to that. And this is a letter in which he advises against another convention. And so it would have had to be an Article 5 convention back in his day. He says, if the General Convention were to take place for the avowed and sole purpose of revising the Constitution, it would naturally consider itself as having a greater latitude than the Congress appointed to administer and support as well as to amend the system. It would consequently give greater agitation to the public mind. An election into it would be courted by the most violent partisans on both sides. It would probably consist of the most heterogeneous characters. It would be the very focus of that flame which has already too much heated men of all parties, would no doubt contain individuals of insidious views who under the mask of seeking alterations popular in some parts but inadmissible in other parts of the Union, might have a dangerous opportunity of sapping the very foundation of the fabric. Under all these circumstances, it seems scarcely to be presumable that the deliberations of the body could be conducted in harmony or terminate in the general good. Having witnessed the difficulties and dangers experienced by the first convention, which assembled under every propitious circumstance, I should tremble for the result of the second, meeting in the present temper of America and under all the disadvantages I've mentioned. 1788, what about 2013? Where do you see characters like George Washington, James Madison, Ben Franklin, Edmund Randolph, George Mason? You could name these people as good as I can. Where do we see these people today? Anyway, where are they? Where are they? Even finding one or two in the entire world would be difficult, I say. And those that are of that character would want what we got. Anyway, there'd be grave risks if we had one of these conventions. And I find it interesting that those that promote the idea of a convention are always telling me they love this Constitution, but they infer by their desire to change it that it's flawed. It's not flawed. There's nothing wrong with it. We've just stopped applying it. Madison said that the powers in the national government are few and defined. They really are. We got to insist that our representatives keep their actions within those enumerated powers. They take a sacred oath to do that. They say they'll uphold the Constitution. Today, upwards of 80% of our expenditures are unconstitutional. So what am I going to do? Here's what I recommend. We got to get our representatives to understand this. We could balance the budget easily and quickly, almost overnight, with these things. Eliminate unconstitutional military adventurism around the world. That's called unconstitutional wars. Eliminate foreign aid. We've got to sunset our entitlement programs. There's nothing in the Constitution that says they can redistribute our wealth, not to the states, corporations, communities, individuals, anybody. It can't be done. That's out of Marxist philosophy. That is not Founding Fathers' Americanist principles. You can't do it. And then get rid of the unconstitutional federal departments and all the functions that are out there. We don't need a balanced budget amendment. No convention can fix this for us. We, the people, have got to just say, go back and follow your job description. They're enumerated right there. Again, as I close, today, we've got to put none but Americans who understand sound Americanist principles on guard tonight. And I hope that this society can continue to be the watchman on the tower to help that happen. Thank you.